Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of the trench run diorama. Today we're going to be working on the diorama base using the Bandai Death Star attack set, as well as working on the LED lights. So here you can see I've worked out the orientation that I want the tiles to be in for the horizontal and vertical surface. And the first thing we need to do is to prep the resin copies that I made of the tiles. So I moulded the tiles from the Bandai Death Star attack set in some silicon, and I made some resin copies as I wanted the diorama to be bigger. So the first thing you need to do is to trim off any flash from the casting process. You can just do this with a craft knife, especially if it's quite thin. We also need to make sure that the bottom of the tile is sanded flat, so that there is no sort of wobble or rock in the diorama base. So to do that I'm just going to use some 80 grit sandpaper. It doesn't need to be very fine as it won't be on show. So after a lot of sanding it looks pretty flat. Give it a test with one of the tiles from the Bandai attack set. Make sure that they still clip together and they sit nice and flush on the flat surface. And they do. So you'll notice that these ones have clips all the way around. That's because I moulded them that way so I could have options as to what orientation I wanted them in. But what I'm doing here is just trimming away the clips that I don't need. The sides without clips will just be super glued to other resin tiles or the front. The side with the clip will attach to the actual Bandai tiles. And there we have it, all constructed, at least temporarily, in the orientation that I'd like it to be in. I've also attached the L joints for the vertical surface. As you can see, I'm testing out the one that I casted here. So to base this diorama we're going to use some hardboard. So what you'll see is just me measuring up, cutting out the hardboard and making two sort of backing pieces for this diorama, one for the horizontal and one for the vertical surface. When it comes to actually cutting, I like to do several light passes with a craft knife on hardboard. So there's less tear out and less warping as you cut. And once that hardboard is cut out and we've got the tiles ready, I'm going to assemble them into subsections. This will make it easier for the final glue up, and it'll also help me arrange the clips for the tiles without having to sort of muck about and fiddle around with them as I'm placing the tiles down. And so once all those subsections are completed, I'll start gluing the tiles down onto the hardboard using some brush-on super glue. And there we have it, the horizontal surface is done. Now we need to work on the vertical, and in order to do this I made the first row of vertical tiles into a single subsection and then glued the next row on top of those rather than gluing them to hardboard first. The reason why I did that was so I could get a nice flush joint at the bottom where the horizontal and vertical tiles join up. So you can see here I'm just gluing up that back panel, getting ready to stick it to the hardboard, using my workbench to make sure that I've got a flush surface at the back. So once we're given that some time to set up, we'll go in with a craft knife and trim up the excess hardboard from the edges, just to clean up those edges of the diorama and then I can trim them in some more hardboard to make it look a little neater, sort of tie it all together. So as you can see, I've got some thin strips of hardboard already cut out to the dimensions that I wanted, and I'll just use super glue again to glue those along the edge, hiding those holes for the clips, and so we've got a nice border. We also need to make the turrets for the Death Star section, and since these are Bandai kits, they go together really nicely, no glue needed. Just clean them up with a craft knife and start piecing it together. The actual turret is slightly more complex, so I'd definitely recommend looking at the instructions for that. I tried without first of all, and it did not go well. Again, same as the tower, beautiful fit on all of the pieces, fully posable guns, and really nicely detailed. Alright, so moving on to the paint job. What I did here was I gave it a coat in a black, sort of semi-transparent black, just to give it some shade in the recesses. And then I used a sort of medium grey colour. In fact, I just used the primer for this first coat because it suited the Death Star colour quite well. And so here I am going in, giving it a coat from one direction to try and make sure that those shadows are left in specific areas. And then did a similar thing with this very light grey colour, almost off-white. And so with this, spraying it from one direction, trying to highlight certain angles of the diorama to sort of simulate the light hitting it. You can see we've got a comparison of one of the X-Wings that I've built with the diorama. Just checking the colours. I still want a nice contrast between the different greys. And I'm going to seal that with some satin varnish before we throw a wash on it. Now, same as with the X-Wings, this is to protect the coat under wash, so that when we come on to wiping the wash off and sort of removing it in specific areas, it doesn't pull the paint off with it. It also helps the wash float into the recesses a little better. The wash we're going to use for this is a mixture of black and sepia. However, with the X-Wings, I leant more towards the sepia side to give it some warmer tones. This time I'm leaning more towards black. And this is a very thin wash. I don't want too much weathering on this piece. The Death Star, you don't really see too much weathering on it. But as you can see here, it's just deepening those recesses and crevices and making sure that all the detail stands out or pops. And then you see on the turret how much detail that wash really brings out. Okay, so similar to the X-Wings, we're going to go in with a damp rag, a very lightly damp rag, and we're going to wash away, wipe away some of that wash. And so it remains in the recesses of the model, but doesn't sit on top. And that's just going to sort of emphasize the contrast between the recessed areas and the flat panels. For the turret head itself, it also adds a little bit of weathering. So you can see there all the shadows are quite nicely enhanced by that wash. And just to finish that paint job off, I'm going in with a very near white. It's a white mixed with a tiny bit of cream. And that's just to give a final highlight to the piece. It's also to try and tone down any flat panels that have been particularly discoloured by the wash. But as you can see, going along the top there, just doing a highlight on the faces that are facing towards the viewer of the diorama or towards the top of the diorama. And just to add a bit of tonal variation for that grey. Now you can see I've done a bit of weathering on the turrets, and I'm just going to show you what I did in this section. So I've got a slightly thicker wash, slightly more dense wash here, and I'm just putting at specific parts along the joints of the turrets and where there are some raised panelling. And I'm going to then drag that wash down using my finger or a cotton swab in order to simulate sort of grime streaks or dirt streaks from the moving parts of the turret. I was fine with these pieces having more weathering than the rest because, you know, they are moving parts, they're mechanical, they're going to have some more weathering, and in the film they certainly had a fair bit of weathering on them. So adding in that wash, dragging it down, trying to simulate some oil spilling down. We also need to add a bit more of a mechanical element to the turret, so I'm going to do a little overbrush of silver on the gun parts of the turret. Don't need a dry brush for this. It's not a dry brush really. I call it an overbrush. I think I heard that term once. But you have more paint on your brush than a dry brush, but less paint on your brush than if you were actually painting it. And what this does, it just catches the raised areas as you drag your brush over them, as you can see on the little cogs on that section there. I just want to give certain elements a metallic sheen, make them stand out a bit more. I'm going to do that on those cog areas and on the guns themselves. So you can see we're starting to really make that detail pop on the guns. As with the X-Wings, I'm going to bring in some weathering powder, and all this is a sort of charcoal brown pastel that I'm going to grind up on some sandpaper, and then using a stubby brush kind of work that into certain areas where I want them to look sort of charred or worn. So I'm doing that on the tips of the gun barrels to make it look like they've been fired, which, you know, they have. Also in some of the mechanical parts and around the weapons, sort of replicating some scoring. And then where I've done the streaks on the turrets, I'm also adding a little bit of that colour because the black looked a little flat. So I wanted some brown tones in there. And then to seal the whole project, I'm going to go in with some matte varnish and give it all a uniform colour, as we've got a lot of different mediums on this diorama at the moment. For the supports for the X-Wings, I'm going to be using some styrene tubes, and this is so that I can run the wires from the X-Wings down through them. But in order to use them, I need to set them at an angle so that the X-Wings aren't just sort of sitting directly out from the diorama. I want a bit more of a dynamic pose. So I'm just using a lighter here to bend that styrene without collapsing the tube. So once it's hot enough, just sort of tease it into shape. Make sure it's got the angle you want, and check that it fits fine with the diorama. Now I'm going to drill the holes for the styrene into the side. I've tried to choose 3 places where the rods won't really be seen, so I've chosen that little hole in the wall there, and you'll see me drilling out the hole for the styrene. I've put a piece of wood at the back because I didn't want to collapse the diorama or dent it in any way, so the wood just supports it. So we've got Biggs's support rod at the back there, flying between that turret and the wall. Wedge is going to be in the middle, and Luke is at the front there, just dodging that tower. Now, in the end, I decided to paint these supports grey. I did ask for some suggestions on Instagram and Reddit, and people said that clear looked pretty good, but you could still see the wires running through them, so I went with a grey in the end. Now for the lights, I'm going to be using these LED filaments, and you'll notice that these are pretty popular at the moment. I think that's all thanks to Boily Hobby Time from YouTube, who has been using these lights prolifically in his videos, and really his dioramas was the main inspiration for this build, so credit to him. And to get that green shade of the turbo lasers, I'm just going in with a transparent green paint. Several light coats of that until we get the desired green look. And just soldering those filaments up. Ignore my terrible soldering. I'm not an electrician. And once you've got your solder on there, you can always go back and clean it up, as that was looking a bit bulky for my liking. So here I'm soldering the second laser bolt in parallel to the first, using the same metal wire that will be coming out from the side of the diorama, just making sure that they're a good distance apart to replicate the turbo laser shots. There we go, that's the first one done. And once I've got all three of those done, I'm just going to measure up the path for them to be going across the diorama using the gun angle, and again drilling some holes along the back of the diorama for those wires to pass through, and sealing them at the back with some super glue and some resin dust from the tiles that we sanded earlier, just to give it a little more strength. And those are all three wired up. These wires are pretty flexible, so you can align them to have whatever path you want really. And that's the first set wired up and ready to be connected. And here's a nice shot of my terrible wiring job. I think we're done. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out, considering it's my first sort of jump into those LED lights and creating a fully lit diorama. I'm pretty happy with how I did. There are things that I'd like to improve, there always are with every project, but I think overall I'm pretty happy. Especially since I replicated one of my favourite scenes in cinema history.